so many things. It's so interesting that these seems to be kind of popping up around the world approximately at the same time. So let's say we're beginning then at around 1933. This peaks at least in Sweden around 1946, something like that. If we were to go back and look at a little bit about what the US were reporting and even what the Germans, I guess, were reporting and the UK, the term, let's talk about the term itself, Foo Fighter. What is it that determines a Foo Fighter, and do you know kind of where it all came from at the beginning, the term?
Yes. One of the biggest misconceptions is that, first of all, the term Foo Fighter was a term that started in November of 1944 and pretty much faded out by March of 1945. It was a term designated to the objects observed by members of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, a U.S. operational combat unit, and most of the men were encountering these strange lights. And they named the object the Foo Fighters after a Smokey Stover cartoon, which was a popular cartoon in the 1940s, where there was the madcap adventures of this fireman and his truck called the Foo-mobile. So that's how the name was attached.
Mm-hmm.
But what was taking place was there were sightings from the beginning of the war on, but they were called balls of fire, they were called circles of light, flares, jets, rockets. The terminology was not limited. It depended upon the observer and what he thought it looked like.
Sure, yeah.
And so eventually, certain objects were just called a flare, but in reality, they were called a flare because the object was illuminated, but it really didn't explain, well, flares don't travel in a horizontal path. And so the Foo Fighter really is a late war term specific to the European theater, Italian theater of operations. And by the time the war was over in Germany, the term had actually gone back to a British term called the balls of fire. However, they would reference the Foo Fighters in the intelligence reports. The intelligence men would actually, make reference to the Foo Fighters in the European theater, and it would seem to be a whole other ball game.
Interesting.
Of course, that's where Len Stringfield had his sighting in the Pacific, over the Pacific in 1945, after the war had ended, August 28th.
All right. Would you say that his sighting, I have not heard about that, so maybe we can talk about that too, but would you say that his sighting kind of is typical for what you have found in the records? Maybe we can go into that, talk just about the kind of behavior, what happens, how long it sustains itself, and so forth.
Okay, well, regarding Len Stringfield's sighting, his was a very remarkable sighting in terms of that it was probably close to what was being termed the Foo Fighters. Now, it was a lot of times the Foo Fighters were pretty much just a ball of light in general, and circular, anywhere from the size of a fist or a baseball to the size of a full moon. Now, most were seen at night. What distinguishes Mr. Stringfield's was his was seen during the day, and he saw 3 in formation. And during the day, they burn like magnesium. What he said, like burning magnesium. They were about the size of a dime, teardrop-shaped, and so they were very similar to the Foo Fighters. But there were very dramatic sightings seen during the war that resembled flying saucers with actual portholes. Some looked like giant zeppelins, but they were absolutely 2 or 3 times larger. And even some of them hovered. And then there were reports some traveled at thousands of miles per hour. And they go through that goes through the war. I say that the earliest wartime sighting that I would consider very, very good would be June of 1942, June 25th.
Mm-hmm.
Captain Ray Zabinski was a Wellington bomber pilot. He was with a Polish division attached to the RAF, Royal Air Force. And he was coming back on a night mission bombing in the Ruhr Valley. And he was flying over Holland, heading towards the North Sea. It was a clear night when his crew reported a copper-colored circular round object approaching the aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about the size of a full moon. The crew, he became alerted to the fact that it could be an incoming rocket, that he realized that an experimental weapon of some type.
Mm-hmm.
He gave the orders to his gunners to prepare to fire. When the object got within range, they opened up. Two different machine gunners, I think the belly gunner, and they were hitting the object. It was close enough that he knew that the tracer rounds were making a mark on the target in terms of it had reached the target, but there was no trace of any of the tracers coming out the other side, as if it was swallowing it up.
Really?
And that startled him. And then, of course, the object was able to maneuver around his aircraft at extraordinary speed, and then take off and go up into the sky and disappear among the stars. His sighting was recorded, so there is, but unfortunately, his, like many other observations, are not found in the official records.
Really?
Yes, and it comes down to the ridicule that the pilots were receiving.
Mm-hmm.
In his instance, Ray Sabinski's instance, he was laughed at. They thought he was drinking.
Sure.
He decided not to pursue it because he didn't want to be grounded. And he did his own little investigation, and some of the pilots coming in behind him had seen the same thing. So it verified in his mind, yes, he encountered something that was very, very unusual.
Huh. Yeah, that kind of makes you wonder how many people actually saw these things but didn't report on them, afraid of being ridiculed, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there were, in late war, some of the, from what I understand, some of the unit commanders absolutely refused to let their pilots use terms like Foo Fighters or anything that had to do with something science fiction related, because they didn't want to go on record as, you know, their pilots seeing something they couldn't explain.
Yeah. So, I mean, you share with us one sighting there. Is there kind of anything that stands out, I guess, in regards to, maybe we can talk about also a little bit what the difference in that regard is of what is a kind of a glowing ball and a disc and a UFO in that sense. What kind of, I guess, what separates a Foo Fighter from a more classical saucer or UFO? Is there any kind of clear difference between that?
Well, the clear difference is that some of the more remarkable sightings, there was no doubt they were observing a structured physical craft.
A more kind of nuts and bolts thing?
Nuts and bolts, absolutely.
Sure.
And where I'd say the majority of the Foo Fighters were luminous balls or luminous light or whatever it was. And I have one report where a Foo Fighter was observed, but they saw whatever it was come up and do a wing over. They actually thought they saw a wing after it did a wing over. But that was only one report. And again, we have to realize that everything was being termed a Foo Fighter. It got to be a point where it was very hard for me to discern what was it they were seeing.
Right.
Now, what helped me was in many of the mission reports, there was a section called Phenomena, and they would throw in there rockets, they would throw in flares, they would throw in aircraft, because that's what it appeared to them, but they weren't sure. So at the time, they had to list it as phenomena, and then, of course, break it down into further categories, such as balloons, such as flares, rockets, and jets. But when you look at the actual reports, you start to say, well, I don't know of any rockets that can do 90-degree turns. And I don't know any of rockets that were able to outmaneuver the aircraft, and yet they stayed illuminated, and there was no jet exhaust. A lot of the pilots in late war knew the difference between a propeller aircraft and the Me-262 when it came on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't take long before they knew the characteristics of that jet, how it operated, how to combat it. And the things that were being seen and labeled as jets had no kind of physical appearance to the sword. There were no dual burners, so there were, it was a solid object constantly illuminated, and it just did not match, especially at night. So you can see where I'm going with this. The terminology was becoming a problem within the Army Air Force, Allied Air Forces, but they were still encountering a phenomena in their mind.
Now, were there any kind of, what should I say, some organization, so to speak, within the military that was kind of set up in regards to tracking these things down, that they wanted to photograph them, get a more clear picture of what they're dealing with here?
Yes, there is, and for the longest time, UFO researchers had based that information on, I think, Frank Edwards was the first to come out, stating that in 1943 there was some type of investigation, British investigation, of the UFO phenomenon. And very little was confirmed. And so I wanted to find if that information existed. And I did find in 1943 there was a British operation in effect, and they called it rocket phenomena investigation. Now again, they're applying the terminology to the objects. However, back and forth among the intelligence memoranda to the different, the bomb group level or bomber command, there was still discussion that though what they were seeing appeared to be rockets, it didn't make sense. So there was a confusion. And then by 1945, after the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Command was set up in England under General Eisenhower, I discovered in January that the Scientific Intelligence Section, Advisory Section, was given the task to investigate the Foo Fighter phenomenon. And what's very interesting is, heading that investigation was Dr. Robertson. So I have the documentation that shows that he actually headed the investigation. And, of course, there were other elements involved with the documentation that stated that Air Technical Intelligence were also involved with investigating the phenomenon. And, of course, that takes us post-war to the 1953 Robertson-Pound report, which has that amazing statement: if the term flying saucers had been popular in 1943 to 45, these objects would have been so labeled. So if it was rocket phenomena, if it was unconventional aircraft, it never has been revealed to be that exactly. There still is a mystery.
Right. And you mentioned Robertson. I guess his first name is Howard, right? Howard Robertson?
Yes.
And at this time, when he was doing this kind of work in and around 1953, he was wasn't he working for the CIA at that time?
Yes, he was hired. Yes, he was. I'm afraid his post-war activities, I can't recall offhand. But yes, of course, he headed the panel. He was the chairman for the CIA-sponsored
to look into this.
And that included Dr. Louis Alvarez, Dr. Louis Berkner, Dr. Samuel Goudsmith, Dr. Thornton Page. And of course they brought in other people